Night, everybody, and tonight's story is called The 12 Wild Geese. The 12 Wild Geese is an example of an international wonder tale. Various countries have versions of it that include children being turned into doves, ravens, and ducks. The 12 Wild Geese is particular to Ireland and was published by the folklorist Patrick Kennedy in the Fireside Stories of Ireland in 1870. There was once a queen who had 12 sons, and though she loved each one of them, she longed for a daughter more than anything in the world. One day, she gazed out her window to where a calf had been butchered on the newly fallen snow in preparation for a banquet later that week. As the queen watched, she saw a raven land beside the carcass to peck at the spilled blood. "I'd swap my 12 sons for a daughter with skin as white as snow, cheeks as red as blood, and hair as dark as a raven," said the queen. The words had no sooner passed her lips than a wind howled into the room as if a window had been opened in a storm. The queen spun around to find an old woman with a long crooked nose standing in the room. Her eyes glittered like broken glass. She waved her walking stick at the queen. "That was a wicked wish you made, and as punishment it shall be granted. You will have a daughter, but at the cost of your 12 sons." Before the queen had time to take back her wish, a gale swirled from the woman's stick, whipping cups, plates, curtains, and cushions into a whirlwind around her. The queen's screams were drowned out by the smashing crockery. When the wind subsided, the witch had gone. Soon after, as the witch had predicted, the queen became pregnant. On the day her baby was due to be born, the queen locked her 12 sons into one of the castle's highest towers and posted guards around it. As soon as her baby girl was born, a familiar wind rushed through the castle, chilling the sweat on the queen's brow, ruffling the newborn baby's hair, and continuing down the corridors until it reached the guarded tower. It whistled between the guards' legs and under the heavy oak door. Moments later, 12 geese were seen flying out through the open window. The king unlocked the door, but found only the boy's clothes and a few white feathers inside. The queen was distraught, knowing that she was to blame for what happened. The king, and indeed everybody in his kingdom, mourned the loss of the 12 princes by dressing in black for a whole year. The princess grew up to be a beautiful girl with snow-white skin, rosy red cheeks, and ebony dark hair. Everybody in the castle vowed to protect the princess by not telling her about her 12 brothers. Being an only child, however, she was lonely, and when she sought the company of her parents, she found them distant, for though she didn't know it, they were grieving solely for their lost sons. And so, the princess found friendship amongst the gardeners, servants, and kitchen staff. Indeed, they got so used to her that they often didn't notice her presence and spoke freely around her. One day she overheard a servant telling another servant about the events that had happened on the day the princess was born, and how the 12 princes had been turned into geese. "That's why my parents are so miserable," she thought, "and it's all my fault." The princess resolved to find her brothers, whatever it took, and stealing food from the kitchen, she sneaked out of the castle grounds. She walked all day, deeper and deeper into the forest, until night descended and she feared she'd have to sleep outside. But then she spotted a light in the distance, and following it, she came to a little wooden house. Inside she found a table set with 12 plates, 12 knives, and 12 forks, and upstairs 12 beds in a row. She jumped at the sound of the door opening downstairs, and hurrying down, she found 12 men who looked so alike they had to be brothers. "Who are you?" one of them asked. When she told them, they all looked at each other and burst into tears. Here was their long-lost sister, who in their hearts they loved, even though she was the reason for their banishment. "You're my brothers, aren't you?" said the princess. They nodded. "But I thought you'd been turned into geese," she said. A man, who appeared to be the oldest of the brothers, stepped forward. We take the form of birds during daylight hours. The princess felt tears welling behind her eyes. My parents' hearts have been broken since you left. Please return so that at least during the hours of darkness they may see their sons. We would if we could, but the curse that turned us into birds also prevents us from ever seeing our parents. As they wondered what to do, a wind pushed open the door, blowing leaves and branches inside. When it died down, an old woman with a crooked nose stood in the doorway. The princess has proved her love for you, her brothers, she croaked. So I have decided to lift your banishment and curse, under one condition. What is it? Asked one of the men. Your sister must spin and weave 12 shirts for you out of bog cotton, to be collected by her and her alone. If she once speaks, laughs, or cries during this time, the 12 of you will remain geese for the rest of your days. With that, the wind whipped up the leaves into a cloud, and the witch disappeared. Determined to break the curse, the princess stayed with her brothers, never laughing, crying, or speaking a single word. She spent her days collecting the tiny tufts of bog cotton that grew sparingly in the surrounding forest and moors. She spent her nights spinning and weaving it into cloth. After 3 long years, she had completed 8 shirts. One day, while her brothers were up in the clouds, she met a handsome prince in the forest. He thought she was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, and he asked her to marry him. She too fell in love, and though she couldn't speak, she replied with a nod of her head. Using sign language, she told him that she needed to return to her house first. There, she retrieved 2 baskets, one containing the 8 cotton shirts and the other containing bog cotton. As they rode off through the forest, the princess dropped a trail of bog cotton so that her brothers would find her. The prince's palace was every bit as grand as he had promised. Everybody was happy to see the prince so in love, except for his stepmother, who took an immediate dislike to the mute girl who dressed in rags and spent her nights weaving bog cotton. Despite his stepmother's misgivings, the prince married the princess, and before a year was out, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The prince's father, the king, was overjoyed to have a grandchild. As much as the wicked stepmother hated the princess, she hated the baby even more because the king was spending more time with the baby than her. The stepmother made up her mind to get rid of the child. One day a hungry-looking wolf appeared in the royal gardens, and the stepmother decided to make the most of the opportunity. She put a sleeping potion in a cup of tea and brought it to the princess, who was feeding her baby. The princess smiled and nodded her thanks. Having drained the cup, she fell into a deep sleep. With an evil grin, the stepmother stole the baby from his mother's arms and brought him out into the garden. Looking around to check that she hadn't been seen, she placed the child on the ground and ran back inside the castle. She watched through a window as the wolf snatched the baby into its jaws and flew into the forest. The stepmother raced back upstairs, pricked her own finger with a needle, and dabbed her blood around the sleeping princess's mouth. Then she ran off to find the prince. "Your Majesty," she said in a panicked voice, "you must come quickly. I fear your wife has done something terrible to your baby." "What do you mean?" "I think she may have eaten it." Though he saw the blood on her mouth, the prince couldn't believe his wife would have done such a thing. When she woke up, she shook her head in denial of the accusation, but had no explanation for the missing child or the blood on her lips. The prince put out word that his child had been stolen, which, though he did not know it, was sort of true. The princess was the most unhappy woman in the kingdom, for she grieved not only for the loss of her parents and brothers, but now her own child. And to make matters worse, she could neither shed a tear nor speak about it. All she could do was continue to gather bog cotton and spin and sew as fast as she could. She looked often for her brothers, but never saw the 12 wild geese that soared above the treetops, keeping an eye on their little sister. As time passed, the princess's grief for her lost son didn't diminish. But the task to free her brothers distracted her, and before long she had two pieces of good news to celebrate. One, she was almost finished weaving the 12 shirts, and two, she was pregnant again. In time, the princess gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The wicked stepmother now hated the princess more than ever. The prince may not have believed his wife had eaten their first baby, thought the stepmother wickedly, but if the same thing happens a second time, he'll have to believe it. By some strange stroke of luck, the same hungry wolf appeared in the garden just like the previous time. The stepmother drugged the princess, stole the baby and gave it to the wolf, which carried it away into the forest. Then she pricked her finger and dabbed blood around the sleeping princess's mouth, just like the first time. This time, when the prince saw the evidence, he was so frightened and upset that he ran away into the woods, leaving his wife in the hands of the wicked stepmother. Delighted there was no one to stop her, the stepmother took charge immediately and had the princess tried before a court of judges for the murder of her two children. Unable to speak to defend herself, the princess was found guilty as charged. When she didn't cry or scream or protest her innocence, it made her look even guiltier. But in her heart, she screamed in anger at her evil stepmother, at the injustice of the world. In her heart, she also wept for her lost children. It was enough to make anyone fall down and die of sadness. Only one thing kept her going throughout all her misery, and that was the thought of her 12 brothers flying in the clouds, waiting to be rescued. Throughout the trial, she clutched tightly to the 11 shirts she'd spent the past 5 years making. The princess was sentenced to be burned alive. Determined to finish the final shirt and free her brothers before she died, the princess sewed night and day without a break, continuing to sew even as she was brought to the pyre on which she was to be burned. As her feet and neck were tied to a stake on top of a pile of dry wood, the princess finished stitching the final arm onto the final shirt. Just as she completed the last stitch, the executioner lit his torch, holding it close to the wooden pile. Now she had completed the task, at last the princess was free to speak, and she shouted out in a cracked voice, "I'm innocent! Find my husband and I will prove it!" The crowd gasped at the sound of the princess speaking for the first time. Everybody froze except for the prince's stepmother, who grabbed the torch from the executioner and set the pyre alight before anyone could stop her. The princess screamed as smoke billowed into the sky, where dark shapes were descending rapidly. 12 wild geese landed on the pyre, flapping their wings to put out the flames. "Put these on," shouted the princess, throwing the cotton shirts into the air. The geese wiggled their necks into them, and one by one transformed into 12 young men, ready to rescue their sister. The crowd watched in amazement as the men untied the princess from the stake, and when the wicked stepmother tried to escape, one of them struck her on the head with a piece of wood. She fell to the ground and didn't get back up. The crowd cheered. At that moment, a gust of wind churned into a blizzard of leaves at the edge of the clearing, and from the center of it emerged an old woman with a crooked nose and a walking stick. On her back, she wore the pelt of a wolf, and in one of her arms she carried a newborn baby. The prince followed her, holding a little boy by the hand. "My children!" shouted the princess, running towards them. She kissed her daughter and son and said to the old woman, "I thought they'd been eaten by a wolf." The old woman smiled. "Wolves are not all bad. You rescued my children. I thought you were a witch." "Witches are not all bad either." Next, the princess kissed her husband. "I can explain." The prince glanced at the lifeless body of his stepmother. "No need, my love. This old woman who rescued your children has told me everything." When they turned around to thank her, she was gone. Where she was standing, a wolf's skin lay on the ground. One by one, the princess's 12 brothers stepped forward to greet their new niece and nephew. The next day, the princess, her husband, her 2 children, and her 12 brothers set out on 14 horses to visit an old king and queen who also had lost children. If any family ever deserved happiness, it was this one, and they made the most of it by never making foolish wishes again. Sometimes what you already have is just enough. Good night, everybody, and stay safe.